Hello, everyone. Good evening. It is wonderful to see so many of you joining us and signing in. It's fantastic from Scotland, from Bristol, from Brazil, from France. Well done to all of you for choosing the best possible way to spend your Thursday evening. My name's Hannah McInnes. Just very briefly, I'm a broadcaster. I present a bit on Times Radio and I host the How To Academy's live events and podcast. And I also chair a number of literature festivals and events. So I'm lucky enough to read a lot of books and interview a lot of fantastic authors, particularly of non-fiction. And probably most importantly, in introducing myself, I am an absolutely enormous and avid fan of all things Women's Prize. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you on behalf of the Women's Prize Trust, and particularly to this event. Let's Talk Non-Fiction Writing, we've called it, which is part of their brilliant New Horizons programme for aspiring non-fiction writers. The Horizons programme, if you're not already familiar with it, is a free toolkit which aims to inspire and support the next generation of non-fiction writers, women writers. And if that's you, which I'm sure it is, you've come to exactly the right place, because as well as being here for this discussion, do make sure that you check out this toolkit if you haven't already. You can find other online events. You can find hugely helpful articles from industry insiders, including from one of our guests this evening, and general wisdom across a wide variety of subjects. So whatever your field is or query you have, I'm sure you'll find guidance there. And that is, of course, what we're going to get to over the next hour or so. This is a really unique chance to hear from our glittering expert panel. I really can't think of better guides to shine a light on and give us insight into the world of publishing and of commissioning, and worlds that can often feel very baffling from the outside and hard to access. So it'll be great to hear their ideas on and their inspiration into research and the more creative side of the process. And I also hope we'll just discuss why recognizing and encouraging women to write non-fiction is so absolutely essential in our society today. So there is a lot to discuss, and there will be a chance for you to ask your questions at the end. So put those into the Q&A box. Hopefully you all know where that is, and we'll get to as many as we can. Also, live captioning is available. So if you're not quite sure how to access that instructions will also be in the Q&A box. Have a look there. In a moment, my fantastic panel are going to give you some more insight and introduce themselves. But just very briefly, for me to say, delighted that we have Josephine Graywood, who's a publishing director at Penguin Press and editor of Why We Read, which is absolutely brilliant. She might tell us a little bit more about that book. Sophie Lambert is a literary agent, and Xingzheng is a journalist and editor-in-chief at Vice UK, and she's also the author of Forgotten Women. So that is very briefly introducing all of you, but perhaps you could give us more insight into what you do and your passions, what drives you. Josephine, we could start with you if that's all right.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Hannah, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It's so exciting to see such an international crowd. So yes, I'm Josephine, and I'm a publishing director at Penguin Press, which is one of several parts of Penguin Random House. At Penguin Press, we specialize in nonfiction. So we have several imprints. One of them is Annan Lane, one is Particular Books, Pelican, which some people might remember from their youth, which was relaunched about 10 years ago. But we really do focus on nonfiction, contemporary nonfiction. We don't publish contemporary fiction as such. It's all nonfiction. And we also look after the Penguin Classics list, which gives a wonderful dynamic. So some of the greatest books ever written and some of the freshest, newest ideas and perspectives out there. Some highlights from my year in terms of what I personally have published this year are 12 Words for Moss by Elizabeth Jane Burnett, who is a poet, The Balanced Brain by Camilla Nord, who is a neuroscientist, and One Woman Show by Christine Coulson, who used to work at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. So my tastes are pretty varied, and I get to publish a wide range of nonfiction books at Penguin Press. As Hannah mentioned, I edited an anthology a few years ago which started as just, an idea to celebrate the wonderful list of Alan Lane authors. And it took on a life of its own because we get to work with some of the most interesting people. And when you think of nonfiction, you might think of a particular facet of it. You might think, oh, history books, biography. And yet there is so much, there's so much more to it. In fact, one of the writers simply said, there's fiction and there's everything else, which which is what's really fun about nonfiction. There is genuinely something for everyone, and it was such a joy to work on that and to sort of bring that into focus because it is such a huge range of different perspectives, ideas. We're not just talking about facts, we're talking about opinions. We're talking about specialists, but maybe people have really brilliant communicators. And it was a real joy to bring that all together in a fun, short package. So I think that'll do for me for now, and we can talk more about any of those aspects as we go along.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to hear that you were behind the balanced brain, which I thought was quite extraordinary, but we won't dwell on that. People can go off and buy it. And Zing, should we move to you next?
Yeah, of course. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us and spending your Thursday night with us. I'm Zing Singh. I'm a journalist and I'm an editor. I work at Vice, where I'm the US and UK editor-in-chief. But for the purposes of this workshop, I'll be talking about my nonfiction. So I published the Forgotten Women book series in 2018. It's made up of 4 books: The Leaders, The Scientists, The Writers, and The Artists. And it's essentially a kind of potted encyclopedia of interesting women from throughout history who have been marginalized and pushed to the sidelines. It was reissued this year by Brazen as an anthology, which is very exciting. And I've also written nonfiction in the form of essays for anthologies like In the Garden, which is a gorgeous anthology all about gardening and nature, and also for East Side Voices, which collects essays from East and Southeast Asian writers from the UK. So yeah, I'm very happy to be here and happy to answer anybody's questions on nonfiction.
Brilliant. Also now start of Have I Got News for You, which was fantastic to see you there last week.
Thank
and very
you.
much not least but last, Sophie.
Hi, thank you, Hannah, and it's lovely to be here. And again, thanks for spending your Thursday evening logging on and listening to us. I'm a literary agent at C&W, which is part of Curtis Brown. I started off as a bookseller 20 years ago on Charing Cross Road and spent many years bookselling and buying. And I think it was there that I really formed my eclectic love of many different types of nonfiction. I represent fiction as well, but as Josephine says, part of the joy of working and for me representing nonfiction writers is that it can span so many different areas. So I represent memoirists like Catherine Cho, who wrote an extraordinary memoir called Inferno, Christy Watson, who wrote The Language of Kindness and has written subsequent books as well, which was felt like a real groundbreaking look into what it really is to be a nurse and to hear a medical story from the perspective of a woman rather than the very male voices which we'd heard to date to that point. I represent Gwen Adshead, who wrote The Devil You Know. She's a forensic psychotherapist at Broadmoor, and really it was a groundbreaking, life-changing for me book on radical empathy. And I get the chance to work with people who are experts in their field, like Tim Spector, who was my very first ever author I signed and sold many, many years ago. So it's been a joy to see him break to #1 this year with Food for Life.
Well, I said that we were in the most extraordinary hands, and hearing you introduce yourselves, I know that is the truth. Let's start. There's a lot, you obviously all cover a lot of different ground, and really importantly, as you've all alluded to, the field is wide open, and there are so many different interests that the audience who've signed in and who listen when this is released after the recording will all come to it with different ideas of what they want to do. But we will try and keep it general and perhaps be a bit more specific at the end. As you said, we've got memoir, nature writing, everyone will be out there with different thoughts. But I expect that everybody has a thought, a nugget of an idea, or perhaps more than that. So let's start with what the first step is. Some people might know more than this, but whether you start by just getting on and writing a proposal, or how far into your process, if at all, before you get in touch with someone like an agent. So if it is an agent, perhaps Sophie, you could just say at the start, what do I do?
Thanks, Hannah. So most non-fiction, not all, but most non-fiction is sold on proposal, and most non-fiction is sold by an agent to an editor. So the proposal is broadly made up of 3 components: an overview, which is a summary of the work, a sample of writing, and a chapter by chapter synopsis that gives a clear sense of the arc of the narrative. And I'm very happy later on, if people want to know more, to go into more detail. And I've also written a piece on the Women's Prize website, which hopefully is useful, going into that in a bit more depth. Some people come to agents with a relatively fully formed proposal, and some agents only want to see a ready, fully formed proposal. For me, I love wearing the creative hat, which is part of, from my perspective, the joy of being an agent. And so a lot of the time, I'm there from the kernel of an idea with someone and help someone pull together that proposal. For example, when I met Christy Watson, she had written 2 novels before, and she'd been a nurse for 20 years. And she sat in my office and said, I want to write about nursing, but I just don't know where to start. And of course, she didn't really think about what was sort of staring her in the face, which was writing about what she knew and in exactly what she knew. But she'd never made that foray into nonfiction before. So we just did it really gradually. And I kind of gave her almost homework exercises and built that proposal. So for some people, it's a case of finding someone with whom an idea really chimes and helping build that together. For other people, it will be coming with a proposal, or at least with an outline of the book they have in mind, to an agent.
Brilliant. And if you look at, there's a link to Sophie's fantastic article and all its bullet points and help in the queue in the chat box. And if you're listening back to this, you go onto the Women's Prize website and you can find amongst the toolkit all the fantastic features, and this is one of those. Zing, listening to that, is that and has that been your experience, or did you have a different route?
So I actually had a different route to publishing, which was that, and this is usually quite pertinent if you're a journalist and you might be listening into this, is that increasingly journalists that I know have been approached by editors who kind of come to them and say, hey, you know, we've noticed you have a particular specialism or a beat. Have you ever considered nonfiction? Do you have any ideas? And that was kind of the kernel for Forgotten Women. My editor on the series, Romilly Morgan, who now heads up Brazen, had a coffee with me and said, you know, we're thinking about doing something in the women's history space around women who've been kind of sidelined. Do you have any kind of ideas for how that might work? And we kind of hammered out the whole concept together. And the tricky thing was then, from that point onwards, having that agreement with an editor, and then I had to retrospectively go and find an agent because, and you know, I was very naive about the publishing side of things. I just saw a contract and I was like, okay, yes, I'll sign it, which is absolutely not what you should be doing, considering that many of us writers are maybe financially illiterate, might be a kind way of saying it. And that's certainly the case for me. So I had to go and find an agent to represent me and also look at the paperwork to make sure that, you know, I wasn't signing away my firstborn.
But I'm sure if people hear financially illiterate, they might relate to that. Not everyone, but I'm sure many listening will. And so we'll come back later if we have time to some of the ways to help in terms of that illiteracy. But really keen, Josephine, to hear from you, you know, having heard 2 different ways in. When does it normally come to you, somebody's idea, or in what form?
It's definitely a mixture of the two. I'd say the vast majority is from agents like Sophie, because agents know the editors relatively well. They know who's interested in what and can match each proposal with the editor who they think will be most receptive to it. So I receive a lot of submissions from agents, and yes, sometimes I will get in touch with someone like Zing and say, hi, I really liked your article on this, or I read your academic book about Y, and I wonder if you'd ever thought of writing a trade book. So there is some active commissioning, and editors do it to a greater or lesser degree. There are some editors whose mandate is to actually go out and find projects rather than receive submissions. And there are different ways of putting together books. So sometimes publishers might actively go out and find the writer because they have the idea. So there's also that sort of co-creation that can happen. It's not something that I'm familiar with, but it is a practice. So there are ways and ways, but for me, the most part is through agented submissions and some active commissioning.
Which begs the question instantly, how do you get an agent, and how do you know the right agent for you? Because we said at the beginning, many different things you might be considering. Sophie, how do people find you, or how do they know it's you they want, and if it's not, how do they find the right one?
Well, I mean, it's a matchmaking exercise in the same way that Josephine alluded to, agents getting to know editors and finding out what they're hungry for and who might be a great sort of fit for in a working relationship. And when I take on a new author, my hope is that that's not just for one book, that it's for many books, and that it's a lasting relationship. And, you know, using Tim Spector as an example, we're now just doing his 6th book contract. And that's always, you know, there are some authors I take on and I know there will only be a single book. It might be a memoir, and it's something that's key for them to be able to write and to share really with a broader audience. But on the whole, we would hope that it's a lasting relationship. So it has to be based on trust. It's just crucial. We are all pretty available to be found. Most agencies have really extensive websites, and each agent tends to have a page. And I would recommend that authors do as much research as possible. It's also a good idea to look at your favorite books and go to the acknowledgements where usually the editor and agent might be named, and again, try and sort of do a matchmaking exercise there. And then there's the sort of old-fashioned route of the Writers and Artists Handbook, which is still available and lists most agencies. And for the most part, our email addresses are there. You know, people can email me direct, and I will always look at everything that's sent to me myself. So I'd like to hope that we're relatively open to people sending things, and submit to many people at the same time. That's on the whole how we go about submitting books to editors, and we would expect the same when people are submitting to us. And take recommendations. You know, if you know someone who has had a book published, talk to them about the experience they've had and what's been good or what's not been good, and think about what's important to you. Some agents, as I said earlier, are much more heavily involved in the creative and editorial side, and some just pride themselves on doing excellent deals and sort of taking the business side on alone. So it depends what you need and want.
Before I come back to Josephine and Zing, I think it's really important to ask, we've talked about financial literacy and how baffling it all is.
Yeah.
When does money part hands with, you know, and come to an agent? Because I think many people would feel, you know, in that early stages, that's not possible.
Yes, so it's a very good question, and one that I think people shouldn't be afraid to ask. So no reputable agency should ever charge for any editorial work or fees for that sort of helping to put together a proposal. The relationship, as I said, is all based on trust, and the way that it works financially always is that once an agent has secured a deal on your behalf and hopefully secured the best terms possible, Then after the contract has been negotiated and formalized, the publisher will then send part of the advance. The advance that a publisher offers is an advance on royalties. It's like an investment on their part that you never have to give back, regardless of how many books have sold, unless you don't deliver the book eventually. And that advance is paid out in portions. So when you sign a contract, you get your first portion of the advance. And the way that works is that the publisher pays the agency, and the agency takes its fee, which is almost always 15% for UK deals going through, and then the rest of the money flows through to the author. So the money always flows in that way. The money never should flow the other way.
Okay, really helpful. Thank you very much. And Zing, if I just come to you, you mentioned that the way you got in through your articles as a journalist and your essays. And actually, I spoke to Sophie earlier, and she was talking about how one of the most important things is to be able to distinguish between whether your idea is a book or an article or an essay. I wonder if you have any pointers on that, whether it would sustain an entire book or whether you should be looking to make this idea first into an article or essay.
Oh, it's a good question. I think if you are already a journalist or a writer of some kind, there's no problem really with putting the idea first out as an article, because if the article does go out and it gets a really good reception, you could bring it to an agent, say, or a publisher and say, you know, I've got an idea for a book. It's based on something that clearly already has interest in it because an editor or a publication has commissioned it as a kind of short form or long form article. I've known of, you know, journalists and writers getting book commissions that way. As for the question of, is this idea an article, a book, or even just a tweet? I mean, I think, you know, putting my hat on as an editor, you need to think about whether or not this book is able to tell a story and sustain a narrative across not just 1,000 words, 2,000 words, but, you know, chapters and chapters. Who will you speak to? What are you going to observe? You know, what is it going to talk about that's going to sustain the reader's interest for that length of time? And often, you know, I'll get pitches from writers for articles where I look at it and I think, this is a really interesting blog post, or this is a really interesting tweet thread. There's not enough material in it to be a full-length article. And if you just apply that attitude towards, you know, book ideas, you know, what I always tell people when I tell them their ideas for articles aren't going to work out is, you know, tell me who you're going to speak to. Tell me where are you going to go for this article? Because, you know, I'm a firm believer in, you know, books and articles should take you places. You should be taking the reader along for a ride. It shouldn't be something that you could just, you know, whack out on your phone at the end of a night on the bus home. You know, you have to think about what kind of story and narrative it's telling over the course of these pages. So, you know, that's kind of my advice for, you know, thinking about whether or not your nonfiction idea has the duration as well to turn into a book. Well, and this is the other thing, it takes a long time to make these books happen, right? You want to make sure you don't get bored within like the first month of working on it.
Really useful, and we will come to the sort of slightly more creative process and how to make sure you do have that discipline later. But Josephine, perhaps your reflections on what they were, you know, both talking about then, how you know it's something that will sustain a whole book and not just an essay, and what you are looking for as an editor.
Yes, I absolutely agree with Zing. And I do, you know, I do sometimes read proposals where it does feel like this can't sustain a book. I think what I would add is that sometimes, especially if it feels very topical, that can be a bit of a false friend, because as Zing mentioned, books take time. So if you feel urgently and passionately about something, thinking about whether the book is the right format for it is quite important. So will you still want to talk about this in 2 years' time? Will people still want to be reading about it in 2 years' time? Or do you need to get that article out more urgently, is maybe one other consideration in that in that distinction between, well, is this really a book? And I'd elaborate on that point about narrative, because Sophie touched on it earlier as well, in terms of the structure of a proposal and seeing as a return to it. And narrative is so important because, again, you can be very passionate about something, have lots of brilliant ideas, and once they go down on the page, it becomes apparent if there is something linking them together. So I think that's one thing. And some questions I find helpful, sort of why you, why this book, and why now? So some why questions, once you've got the, got the ideas, the themes, or whatever it might be, the stories on the page, asking some why questions, I think, can distinguish between, well, is this a collection of really brilliantly written pieces that I could blog about or try to get published? Or is there something that, remember, the reader will be parting with their hard-earned cash? Yes, this is something that I feel like, for whatever reason, and it doesn't have to be sort of a political reason or whatever, but I feel like, yeah, I can give people a reason to buy this book. And that comes a little bit later, obviously, but I think that is important as you sort of think about, okay, well, is this gonna fly? I think some sort of why, and that can be an emotional why as much as a practical why or an intellectual why.
So you talk about that, you must have that intense passion for it, because you're going to be writing it for a long time, and as you say, it's going to come out, in 2 years, so you must still be interested in it and not something that's of the moment. But how much should you get that balance right between an idea that you are passionate about, or looking out and seeing where the gaps are, perhaps in the narrative, in society, in what people are talking about, Sophie?
Well, I think, just as Josephine was saying, topical things sometimes date very fast, and actually a lot of the time people don't have an appetite to read a full-length book about it in 18 months' time, unless there's maybe a reflective quality to it. On the whole, we want to read books that have more of a timeless quality to them, I think. And some books have to be rushed out for a purpose, whether it's a forthcoming event or, a forthcoming election. But I mean, you have to, my view is, on the whole, the books that I want to read and that I want to work on always are driven by a passion and a desire and an intrigue and a curiosity, and often an expertise as well. And readers are sophisticated. There's so many good books available. And if something isn't written with sufficient passion or depth, I think it's clear. And I think it just won't resonate in quite the same way. So, and I think sometimes the most unusual things can be the most passionate things, and actually lure people in ways that people don't expect. So, thinking about 2 authors who've both been hugely successful, one who I'm lucky enough to represent and one who I don't, but Merlin Sheldrake and Cal Flynn. So Cal Flynn, I represent, wrote a book called Islands of Abandonment, where she traveled around the world going to places which are no longer inhabited by people. And her writing is exquisite, but there's a wonder that is breathed into the way in which she takes you by the hand and leads you and shows you places which you're likely never going to go to, but it's driven by her passion, and that's just there. It's so present. So I think that people see if something is approached with cynicism or seizing something for the sake of it. So whatever it is, whether it's a memoir, whether it's someone who's desperate to offer up a sense of what they do in their particular field of work, or whether it's someone driven by passion, like those 2 authors I've explained, I think that's what, for the most part, we're all looking for, whether we're agent, editor, reader, and author.
I'd love your reflections on that as an author and a journalist. A journalist perhaps doing the former, grabbing the thing everybody's talking about and going for it, and an author doing what Josephine and Sophie are talking about, which is doing something that's innately interesting to them.
Yeah, I think you always have to be driven by interest. And I think, a lot of the journalists I know will say that I'll pitch stories because I'll see something as, trending or going off on social media. And I know that I can turn around a story really quickly for an editor who will like this pitch. But when it comes to writing a book, people have mentioned it's got a durational quality to it. So you will be working on it for a long time. So you have to be passionate about it. But also more than that, unlike writing an article, say, which maybe you would promote with a tweet or a post on Instagram, if your book does well and, gets into, the publishers prioritize it in terms of publicity, you will be expected to publicize that book. You'll be expected to go out to bat and explain to people why they should read the book, why you're interested in it. And you can't fake that kind of enthusiasm. You can't fake that kind of passion and knowledge about your subject. So in my mind, at least, and, I'm sure I'll be corrected by, Josephine or Sophie if I'm wrong. I think passion should lead everything. I actually know Merlin ever so slightly. His book, for those of you who don't know, it's about fungi. He is the most passionate person about fungi you have ever met. It is unreal. I ran into him at a literary festival and he talked my ear off about fungi for about 15 minutes. You can't fake that kind of enthusiasm and devotion in a book, especially not if it's going to be, on the longer side, particularly if it involves a lot of research. And that's the other thing. If you're not passionate about doing the research, the book will stand up short because it won't be researched as thoroughly as you like, if that is the kind of book you want to write.
No, absolutely. I think it's so interesting to reflect when you're in the beginning stages on this whole long journey, as you're talking about. You're going to be with your book for a long time, so the passion needs to be there. And also, I couldn't agree more about Merlin Sheldrake. I think that if fungi had a representative on Earth and they'd chosen him, they would have chosen Merlin Sheldrake. He is absolutely passionate and he is so authentic and unique. And that's something I'm, love to ask you about, Josephine. Perhaps we'll start with you. There's another fantastic article on the Women's Prize website. It's by Kathy Renson-Brick, and she's talking about the importance of finding your own unique voice. And she's talking about this with regards to a memoir. But I think with nonfiction, if you're an academic, this is incredibly important, or whatever you're doing. So I'd love your advice, Josephine, on finding your voice, making it, you said, why you?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that comes through, right? If I can hear the author's voice on the page, that really helps answer that part of the question already in the material. I think it really varies because there is such a wide range of nonfiction. Sometimes it is about finding your narrative voice. I was speaking with an author's book I've recently acquired Thea Leonarduzzi, who is much like Singer, was an editor at the TLS before and is used to writing in a certain vein. And she was saying even for her, she had to hone her eye, she said, how to put herself into what she was writing. And that takes time, and it's such an iterative process. So even if you're very experienced at writing, it can take a while to find out, well, as an author, what do I sound like as opposed to as a critic or as an editor or as a journalist? So it's I guess I'm sharing that with you because it's something everyone has to deal with if they're going to write a book. It's such a different mode that needs to be sustained. And I think there's something about having the confidence of what you bring to the subject. Because even if you don't feel like you're the greatest prose stylist, but you have a real passion for something, as we've been talking about, that passion can come through. So I don't think it's necessarily a handicap to feel like, well, I'm not, the greatest voice of my generation, and therefore I can't write a good nonfiction book. So sometimes the passion is what brings that voice, because that just comes through in the way that a writer will express themselves, even if it's not the most poetic prose you've ever come across. So there are definitely different ways into it. And I think it is more a question of maybe developing that confidence for what you're trying to say and having that clarity of what you'd like to say. And I think that does just help it flow a bit better. And that's why trying to second guess either the agent, the publisher, or the reader, and what they want from you as an author, I think can really backfire. And I've definitely read proposals on that, in that vein, where it feels like perhaps the author's trying a bit too hard. And actually, I wish they might just relax and just just tell me what they want to say, rather than think I must write it this way in order to get your attention, or I have to do it this way, otherwise it won't work. So it is really about what is unique to the writer. And remember that at publishers, there's usually a whole team of people to figure out the other stuff, right? Where's the gap in the market? How do we make it stand out? That's our job. So that's not something I think as prospective author one should spend too much time thinking about, but instead I think really thinking about, yeah, why me? What am I bringing to this? And feeling a bit confident about that, to just let that come through on the page.
So Sophie and Zing are both nodding a lot along with that. So perhaps your brief reflections on that question of finding your authentic voice and you know, being you, and then we'll move on. Time's going very fast. Sophie.
Yeah, I mean, I think those why questions are absolutely key, and completely agree on those. And I think I always think it's useful to try and step right back, try and encourage an author to step right back. And I ask them the really sort of big questions that I believe an editor will also ask, which are, you know, what's the intention here? What's the purpose of this book? Which sounds like a really reductive thing to say, but it's really important to know what it is that you want someone to take from it. So I often say to an author, you know, if you were to put that into someone's hands and they were to go away and read to it, what would you want them, how would you want them to come away changed? You know, what kind of conversations do you want them to have as a result of reading it? And I suppose it goes back to that sort of, you know, integrity and, you know, overused word, but authenticity. And often people find themselves sort of too far zoomed in, and actually it's then difficult to have a bit of perspective on what is this that I'm trying to grapple with, and how do these, you know, often incredible, fascinating, anecdotal parts make a whole. And there will be a way around it for sure. And absolutely, Josephine's completely right that, you know, there are lots of people to help you find that, but really useful and interesting, you know, essential really to ask those very key questions that hold it all together. And it's why I suppose after that clarity is there, that then it's about a structure that holds those ideas together. And once you've got a great structure, you can be so playful, and you can kind of go off and do incredible things with what you're writing about or the way in which you're writing. But if you've got a really clear purpose and structure, it's an enabler, essentially. It sort of gives you much more in the way of choice, I think.
Well, thank you. And Zing, from your personal perspective, your reflections on that, on, as you said, the word sort of finding your authentic voice is overused, but it's incredibly important that we talk about it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think especially if you're a first-time author of nonfiction, there's a bit of trepidation around, you know, what if my voice isn't good enough? What if my voice isn't, you know, the kind of voice that readers want to hear from? And I think especially if you're starting out, it can be very easy to look at, you know, what's on the market and see what's selling and go, okay, maybe I'll be more successful if I'll mold myself on this person, or maybe I'll get more attention from agents if I'm more deliberately in that mode of this certain other author. And I think that's kind of a fool's errand, really, because, you know, at the end of the day, if it doesn't feel authentic, you even if it does get picked up and commissioned, you will be asked to essentially put on a pantomime show of something that is not actually you for the length of a book, for the length of a publicity cycle. And at the end of the day, it's absolutely more trouble than it's worth. And I think it's, you know, what I find really interesting is that while I've been here at Vice, we've had several of our writers go on to publish books, and they've all done amazingly, incredibly different things. So, you know, there's Daisy Jones, there's Amelia Abraham, there's Hannah Ewens. They all publish nonfiction books about very different things, and they all manage to kind of find a voice outside of the Vice institution, which is a very specific tone of voice. And I think that's really instructive as well, just because you feel like you might be, maybe you already write for another company or you write for another publication, but you shouldn't ever feel kind of hemmed in and unable to develop your voice as a person.
You've both Josephine and Zing, you've both said that people are often thinking, I'm not good enough, I may not be the best person out there. I'm sure that that is amongst all aspiring writers, but perhaps particularly amongst women writers, and perhaps particularly amongst aspiring non-fiction women writers, because of how few, sadly, still they see out there as role models. And you know, I said at the beginning, I'd love your reflections on why this prize, why these toolkits, why these events are so important, because the statistics are still quite depressing. You know, there are far fewer women writers out there still. They get recognized in prizes, you know, much less frequently than men. Josephine, why is that, and how can we change that? How can these sorts of conversations change that? Why do people need to gain the confidence to be able to change that?
Yeah, I've definitely experienced that as an editor, especially as an editor who works a lot with academics. And something that's emerged from me there is the structural legacy that we're dealing with.
Yeah.
So structurally, through that pipeline, for example, it is more likely to be the male colleague who is at the top of the field and the person that is writing the book on the subject. And for the female colleague who has been in that world for a certain amount of time, and with all those structural inequalities, it can be very difficult to have all that confidence we've just talked about, right? In terms of finding your own voice. So I think there are definitely structural elements at play, historically and to this day, in terms of the women writers we hear from, especially when we're looking to hear from someone who is very expert or knowledgeable in their field. There are so many broader things at play that I think might be hampering women, and that women are, definitely working against and coming through. So I guess there's one point there about nonfiction being about expertise and women perhaps not having the same access to those positions, that status within, e.g., academia or even the wider culture. And I think that is something that is shifting. But if you look back through what has happened over the last, 50 years, but before that, it's just apparent. And it's apparent when you work on the Penguin Classics list as well as the contemporary nonfiction, because you can just see, right, women's access to just the room of one's own to write a book just wasn't there for so long, and it is taking time, and we're still at it to get women that space and time to actually create, their best written work. So I think there are huge structural things at play, that we are, we're making progress. And that's why the Women's Prize for Nonfiction is such an important thing, because I think giving it a focus, having events like this to talk about it and to encourage women writers in nonfiction, because the confidence part is so important. And when you don't see as many women writing a certain type of nonfiction, it might not feel like, well, there's a space for that. And I think there's a second thing that I've observed, which is because of that, certain genres are quite male dominated. And therefore, as publisher, when you're publishing into that space where, the vast majority of people who are buying whatever it might be, are used to hearing from men, that poses a challenge. And even with the best will in the world and the best campaign, we're moving in a cultural context in which people just aren't as used to hearing from women in that way. And so there's a lot that needs to shift in the culture and as well as within everything we're doing in publishing. And that's something we've been thinking about for a while in the team I work with at Penguin Press, because we are so focused on precisely this kind of nonfiction. And sort of looking at the list, it was just, you know, it was so apparent that if we were publishing the best nonfiction, we needed to make sure that there were more women. Otherwise, it suggested that, you know, somehow women were excluded from this, which is not at all the case. So yeah, there's work to actively be done. There's work that I know has actively been done within Penguin Press where I work, and I'm sure it's happening elsewhere. And with the two, hopefully we can make a bit more progress, and something like the Women's Prize for Nonfiction is a real catalyst for that, and a great focal point to bring together, you know, different energies to actually get things moving a bit faster.
I mean, because Sophie, those voices are there, those experts are there, of course they are. So are things changing? And if people are listening, you know, words of encouragement and to give them the confidence to realize that a male academic can't do it better. And also, I think really importantly, that women often, when they do emerge in nonfiction, feel restricted to certain areas, and that needs to change.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it needs to reflect the range and diversity of readers, and for so long the proposals that, or the email suggestions that I would receive would be predominantly from men, I think. And but I think over the last maybe 10 years that's changed quite predominantly. And I think to have something like this that actively celebrates the breadth of women nonfiction writers is essential, because it needs to be hand in hand with the fiction writers too. And I think, but it definitely does go back to really early stuff, like, you know, girls being encouraged to embrace sciences at school. You know, it really starts from those sorts of places, doesn't it? And you know, history being so dominated until recently by male writers. I mean, it sort of feels extraordinary, really. And just, I think also sort of the way things had been published to almost crudely, supposedly appeal to different groups of people, when there should be, you know, a readiness to appeal to everyone. And it is entirely possible to do that. So it's just great to try and disrupt that in a really healthy way, in a really positive way. So, you know, there is an issue. We're coming together with, you know, the Women's Prize to highlight that, but also much more importantly, to move forwards and to celebrate and to discover. So I feel, you know, I feel like there's huge amounts to be done. It's, as I say, really celebratory, but positive, and we can absolutely make a big difference.
I mean, that's the key, isn't it? Disrupting in a positive way. This
Yeah,
only adds to the national conversation. It only makes society better if we're hearing from voices that are making up a massive part of our society. Zing.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, you know, women for the longest time have been so hampered as well by the fact that they were expected to be, you know, the caregivers that, you know, and that makes it sort of difficult if you are a nonfiction author to take that trip to, you know, the jungles of Indonesia to write your great nature book, you know. And I think slowly that is also changing. Childcare has become much more equitable. And also a lot of the books that I'm interested in, like in nature writing and nature books, you know, have been genres that have been typically dominated by men who were thought of as being, you know, the strong, adventuring explorer type who could sail off to the Arctic and write a book about that. And that is slowly changing. You know, like books like H is for Hawk are incredible works of nonfiction and memoir. And I think it has to work in tandem with both the publishing and the wider society, like Josephine was saying, because, you know, a lot of the conditions in which women are expected to write in are just kind of oppositional to, producing books, producing, long works of nonfiction. And I think hopefully that is changing over time.
I'm really fascinated by that point, and going to go to audience questions just in a moment. But you talk about childcare, the conditions for women writing. I'm sure a lot of people listening are thinking, I've got this idea, I want to write my book, but there is no way I can devote my time, all my time, to that. I either have to have another job to sustain my life, or I need to look after my children, whatever it might be. So Zing, I just wanted to come back to you on sort of tips to keep going, to not let your passion and your idea and your desire to write this book slip. It's hard, but how do you do it?
I mean, I had to keep myself accountable through friends and loved ones who would remind me of looming deadlines. I know a lot of my other friends have had huge success in applying for grants, which kind of takes the financial pressure off and allows you to kind of focus on writing without worrying about, getting the next freelance job to cover your bills. And I also know a lot of people who have very supportive spouses, whatever gender they are, who have, agreed to take on the caregiving or the housework, or even, earning the bills while this other person writes their great piece of nonfiction or fiction. And I think that is also really important. I think sometimes it's really easy to fall into this oppositional mindset where, it's the patriarchy kind of stopping women from writing their great novels. And some of that is true, but also there are lots of people within the patriarchy who are also trying to uphold and uplift women's voices, and some of them also happen to be men.
And if people are thinking, I've got my idea, I've got my time set out, my hours in the morning, but I just can't start. I mean, Josephine, a lot of writers seem to say, just sit there, treat it like an exercise, like going for a run. Even if your ideas aren't flowing, you need to sit. And I think there's this great quote, I think, from Rumi, who says, what start along the way and the way appears. I mean, do you think that that's right? Just sit down and start and have the confidence to do that.
Absolutely. And I think I'd also just add that there might be an illusion that most writers get to write full time. That's just not true. That's just not true. The vast majority of writers are not writing full time. So that is quite a false illusion, actually, that, you get to just sit there all day and write. That's not how the vast majority of the best books are written. Perhaps once you've reached a level of international fame, it might be, but until that point, people are juggling around, be it a teaching job or a university job or childcare. So don't feel too alone in the fact that you are trying to squeeze this in around your life, because most writers are squeezing in the writing around their life. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because everything in your life will feed into your writing and it will enrich it. And that is such a great thing. And so your point about, sort of the morning pages type ritual where you just sit down and you have a half hour every morning of just writing your thoughts, that's a brilliant way to do it, to get started. And I think some people might like that solitude. It is very lonely writing. And other people might want to just chat to friends and whoever they can get to listen to them about what they're thinking and bounce ideas off them. A good friend of mine is working on a book, and I remember in the proposal stage, she was saying, what do you think about this? And what do you think about that? And it was really helpful for her to simply bounce ideas off other people. So depending on your personality and what works for you, the discipline of getting up and making time might work, or maybe starting to build a network of people, like-minded people, interested people, who you could maybe have coffees with or regular chats with, that might help you just get a few sparks going. I was chatting to a colleague over tea in the office, and when her book came out, she said, actually, that conversation we had, it made a really important connection for me in writing the book. So I guess I'm saying that we might also think of this writing thing as this really solitary, it's all down to you process. And as we've been discussing, a lot of it is so collaborative with agent, with editor. And so that also can extend to those early stages. You might feel very protective of the idea, but with a few trusted people, it might actually help to start just bouncing ideas off people, seeing their reactions, and that will give you something to maybe get going with.
Yeah, so sort of living life as research. It could be a sociable process. Actually, I think I was listening to one of the other online events, and the author in question was saying she always goes outside to write, talking about the reverse of a solitary process under a tree, or I was thinking on a day like today, you might freeze, but if you're in the UK. Sophie, please feel free to reflect on that, but also I might just bring in some of the audience questions, which are specifically to you. And we've touched on this, but Joe asked how far you should get on with your manuscript before showing it to someone like an agent or an editor. And there's also a question saying, is it true that you don't have to have finished your non-fiction manuscript when showing or approaching an agent, but you do have to have finished a novel before that scenario?
So all good questions. Most fiction is submitted to editors finished, like fairly polished. So while most agencies call for the first 3 chapters of a novel when you're submitting, if you haven't finished it, the frustration can be if an agent calls in the rest of the manuscript, the novel, and you just say, well, it's kind of halfway there, or it'll be there in 6 months, the agent may have sort of lost that initial enthusiasm. So where fiction is concerned, I would really encourage you to get to the point at which you feel you can't take a novel any further. Where non-fiction is concerned, on the whole, it's sold to publishers as a proposal, as we've said, and that proposal is made up of those different parts. Now, agents work differently. Some agents want a fully formed proposal before they read anything, and that is then a case of doing the things that we've discussed and talking to people, trying things out, saying it out loud, what it is that you're putting together. But there are other agents who will be really happy to be collaborative. And actually the most important thing for them is to have a summary of what you're trying to do. And it may just be that that's a 4-page summary, but it's got such a enticing hook. It feels so appealing and so clear that the agent just feels like, yes, I want to read more, and then would ask you to maybe go and write a sample, and they might back and forth with you on that. So there's not a kind of precise process, I would say, but when I send a proposal out to Josephine, it needs to be in really polished, shining form. So I may go back many, many times, even if I'm taking on a seasoned, brilliant writer, like, I don't know, Sophie Roberts, who's a fantastic journalist. Her first book, The Lost Pianos of Siberia, we went through, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 different iterations of that proposal before I sent it out. The first one was great, but by the end it was brilliant. And that's what you've got to be, because Josephine receives loads and loads of proposals. Lots of them will be great, but you really want yours to stand out. So the back and forth process is key. And I think it's, from just speaking for myself, it's capturing my imagination that really is the key initially. And if you can do that, then I'm really open to lots of creative work and input.
Okay, thank you, brilliant. And I think someone was asking, if you are pitching out journalistic ideas or starting pitching out journalistic ideas, how do you know which editors will like your taste and the angles that you are interested in?
So I think a good starting point is to look at the articles that you enjoy reading and that you think speak to what your writing has to say. And then figuring out through a process of reverse engineering, who the editor on those pieces was. So for instance, let's say you really enjoy certain essays in the LRB, you might be able to reverse engineer and find out the author's Twitter account. You might find that author's post promoting that essay, thanking an editor for their edits on the piece. And then you'll have an idea of, what that editor is interested in commissioning. It's usually quite easy nowadays with some, minor stalking to figure out what editors are interested in through their social media, because they'll be posting about things that they've enjoyed reading. They'll be posting about things they've enjoyed commissioning. And in general, you can kind of get a feel for the kind of person they are and what they might be interested in commissioning and editing more about.
Okay, yeah, Josephine, probably if you want to reflect on that, great. And also a few questions coming in on memoirs. Sophie, we could come back to you, but I might ask Josephine first, because eventually, obviously, it will come to you how a memoir proposal would stand out for you, and also how someone asks if what you're writing is memoir, non-fiction, or if you should make it fiction.
Oh, that's such a good question, the latter. I think memoir can be instinctive, can't it? Especially for a first book. And at the same time, you might have had the experience of a reader that often when you read a debut, the author is writing from their own experience. So you're not alone if you're facing that, because we talk about these genres, but actually there is so much fluidity and overlap. And the truth that comes through in a novel that is based on your experience is no less valid than the truth that comes through in a sort of non-fiction memoir. So it really is a case of, well, how does it feel when you start writing it? And sometimes a fictional voice allows you to access certain ideas, perspectives that perhaps don't feel comfortable when you're writing them in your own voice. One of my authors has written non-fiction and in a quite memoiristic way for her first two books. And her next book will be fiction, because actually something that came out in the research process through researching family history felt like something that needed a fictional vehicle in order to be told. And so I think you will know, which is an unhelpful answer to that question, but you'll know your limits as a writer if you start writing it as memoir and you think, I can't really say what I want to say whilst presenting this as, the events that happened. But if I could give myself a bit of freedom to sort of move between time and place and to put some words in the mouth of someone else that didn't actually say them, that would actually allow me to tell the story more truthfully. And I think that is something that a writer can come up against. And I think that only comes out through the process of writing it. So that was the second part of the question. And the first part was, how do you make your memoir stand out?
Yes.
So that's a really good question. I feel like for a long time now, and Sophie, I'm sure, can speak to this, we've been getting Memoir Plus, you might call it, which is, it's a memoir about an issue, right? It's a memoir, it's my story. And going back to all these why questions we come up against, the reason to read it is that it tells you, what it means to be alive in 2023, or what it means to be on the front line of healthcare, or what it means to, and so that has emerged. I think we went through a time of maybe about 10, 15 years ago when it was about misery memoirs, and it was, if something terrible had happened to you, that was a reason to write about it. And I feel like we've moved more into a place of, what's the issue here? So what's the formative experience here that is relatable, that you're drawing people into? So I find that they're the ones that do stand out for me, if there's, something in there that I can engage with, because otherwise it is very much a stranger's story, which might be fascinating. And at the same time, if it's a grief memoir and it's beautifully lyrically written, it's about nature, you get H is for Hawk. If it's, a professional memoir about working on the front lines, you get Christy Watson's books. So I think Memoir Plus is a great way to expand the readership for your personal story. It could be family memoir, and it could be about, intergenerational trauma, or it could be about beautiful inheritance. But what is the thing? Otherwise, it can be quite hard for the reader, ultimately, to connect with that story, no matter how beautifully it's told.
Okay, thank you. And Sophie, please do feel free to reflect on that. But I'm going to, if it's okay, just put another question to you, because I want to get in as many as we can. So feel free to reflect on the memoir questions. But also Charlotte asks, hi Sophie, if an agent-author initial relationship is based on trust and a kernel of an idea is sometimes enough, what aids this trust? For instance, does the agent want to see that the author has been published before, or other examples of writing?
So I think the trust is about a shared vision. It really is, for me, as simple as that. So it's, does this agent and does this author feel similarly ambitious, but also have a similar clarity about what this is, what this stands for, and how you might help an author to get to that place. So yeah, I mean, it's great if someone's had an article published, and particularly if it's relevant. But I still really want to focus on the book, on what it is, and grappling with those big questions. And I think it really ties into all, you know, Josephine's insight and wisdom. And I agree with everything she says. I think that the memoir plus gives so much scope and range, and it feels much more like an invitation for the reader to be part. And I think that so often with memoir, you need these little tiny kind of invisible threads to go from the author to the reader. Otherwise, it can be quite impenetrable. And I think you also need to sort of reflect on what people have an appetite for, and what's going on in the world. And at the moment, sort of in our post-pandemic world, there's such a desire and an appetite for wonder and inspiration and answers. And there's ways that you can then frame a memoir as a sort of memoir plus, but that then incorporates some of those things, rather than people seeking, you know, that sort of phase, as Josephine says, of people really reading a lot of those so-called misery memoirs. That's not something that people are wanting to read now, for really good reasons. But you know, honestly, the best thing you can do is go into a great bookshop, look at what's there, look at the back page, look at how a publisher has carefully chosen to present that so that it feels enticing and inviting. And that's what you've got to do as an author. You've got to invite a reader to want to come with you and come away a bit changed.
I mean, that's so true, isn't it? Saying reading is such an important part of the writing process. Reading outside of your interests and within your interests, and just gobbling up as much as you can, I suppose, as research.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a question actually on here who's by someone who's asked, are there any resources that help you structure your chapters into a whole narrative? Yeah, so this person says they work in computer science and they keep getting bogged down in the macro and micro details. I mean, my advice for someone like that who's working on a kind of technical nonfiction book is, you know, read other nonfiction books in that area, you know, try and figure out how they've done it in such a way that it invites a kind of more general reader in. You know, it's not, you know, hidden, you know, when you read a book like Hidden Figures, for instance, which the movie was based on, she has to explain, you know, how science works and, you know, astrophysics and mathematics and all the rest of that. But at the end of the day, it is a very human story and it follows humans. So I would say that if you're doing a nonfiction book that feels very technical and sciencey, always look for the characters, because the characters are the people who are out there doing things. They're creating the narrative, they're generating the story. To a certain extent, you know, if you can explain the details and the nitty-gritty through those characters, it works and it's a very effective way of doing it. But at the end of the day, people will remember the book for, you know, the characters, for the story, and not so much for the details, right? Because that's what, you know, textbooks are for. That's what, you know, lectures are for. When people read nonfiction, or at least when I read nonfiction, what I'm looking for is a kind of glimpse into a world that I might never have known about before. And the way to look at that is through the eyes of other people.
Brilliant. No, I'm so glad yes, that question was definitely for you, or on its way to you. You've answered it perfectly. Just another question, Josephine, you mentioned the balanced brain. That's obviously from a very expert point of view on mental health, but somebody asked whether you could provide some tips and advice on the self-help mental health genre and the submission process, but from a lived experience, again, rather than from someone like Dr. Camilla Nord.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think it depends on the book, and we'd like to put things into categories, but we've just been talking about memoir. Sometimes memoir, when writing from lived experience, especially this kind of in the broader sense we've just been talking about, can be a useful way of coming at the subject. So that's one thing to consider. If it's about lived experience, is it about framing it in an autobiographical way and landing the key points, for example? Because we come back to those key questions. And if you're not the expert, the why you question can be a tricky one to answer. Whereas if you own the fact that, well, this is my lived experience, and think about the way to weave that into the offering, then already that's more persuasive. And absolutely, you can be expert by experience. And some of those books are, the most compelling for the reasons Zing's been talking about, in terms of the human story being the vehicle through which to get the ideas across. So I think that would be my one main pointer, is to think, well, is that something to lean into, rather than to, because we're talking about nonfiction, present it as objective because it's nonfiction, whereas actually if it's subjective, then that's a great thing, and maybe that's something to actually embrace.
Well, thank you so much, and for so succinctly finishing your answer on 8:15, almost on the dot. Just time for me to say that, as I mentioned at the beginning, and we've alluded to lots of the fantastic articles there. I know they've been posting links brilliantly in the Q&A section and the chat section, but the toolkit's available to browse on the Women's Prize website. There's another event in January, which is all about enriching your writing through historical research, so make sure you sign in for that. The first Women's Prize for Nonfiction long list is going to be announced on the 15th of February, so you need to mark your diaries for that. And the best way to keep in touch with all the information is by subscribing to the Women's Prize newsletter. And also, if you want to tell someone else that this event was very well worth listening to, if they're an aspiring nonfiction writer, there will be a recording of the conversation which will be available, and that's available for a limited time, so you should keep an eye on your emails for that. But thank you very much to everyone who's joined us, and thank you so much, Josephine, Sophie, Zing. Your advice is utterly invaluable, and could listen to you all for a lot longer, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.